Let me do a quick, they have bedtime stories, so this is the opposite. What would you call that? So instead of wake-up story, yeah. So this is a wake-up story. And John, you can add anything if I get it wrong. So the wake-up story is kind of a, kind of answering some of these questions about. It's like using the mind or metaphor that we know from what is real, using like a scientific metaphor and developmental metaphor to explain, because what we're looking for is, okay, what is this feeling of being like separate and bounded and small? And what is this feeling then of, well, then when we're free, we feel, oh, unbounded and everything. And why do we keep going back to the bounded and small? That seems to be this habit. And if we can't kind of figure out what is all this and how does that work and where to look and how to look and what to look for, we end up kind of making a metaphysics of it or kind of believing some, old religious belief or spiritual belief. So though you can have any, so the kind of the modern view is you're allowed to have any religious or spiritual beliefs you want, and that may help. So it's like respect for that. And yet, in some ways, what we're talking about here is really about what's a human being. Like, what's that? It may have to do with something we don't know about, some unknown certainly, and some other metaphysics, but we don't know, because everyone seems to have different views of that. But let's look, so we'll look at kind of what this bound and unbound feeling is. And we've kind of explained it in different cultures. So if we start with the Big Bang and come forward. So just very simply, and we'll go up through developmental. So there's this energy going out, and as it cools, it starts to come into different distinct forms, and it comes into like a primordial pool, and molecules start to form, and they're just like chemistry is just happening, and some of it's surviving and some of it's not surviving. And then at some point the chemistry forms a membrane. So it forms into, the chemistry starts to have an inside and an outside, and it starts to, in the later stage, something like an amoeba, so you have something to get a sense of. But there's an inside and an outside, and then as it develops from really just chemistry, it develops a sensitivity to its environment. As it reads what the environment is, and it starts to then even determine what is helpful and what is not. So let's say there's a pool and one's really hot water and one's really cold water. All of a sudden that membrane takes itself to be distinct, and it starts to actually develop ability to move away from and toward, in order for it as now a membrane to survive. And then it develops ability to replicate itself. So it starts to, that membrane all of a sudden splits off into two membranes. And now we've got survival and reproduction, like very early on. And movement, it's already moving. Then it starts to develop something where there's almost like a nervous system kind of, where it starts to feel that sensitivity go to a place where it realizes it can't just keep contracting and moving everything, but that there's almost, the complexity is, okay, what is that? It almost has to delay its movement a little bit. So there starts to become almost a little part of the organism that plays the role of distinguishing whether something is for the survival or against it. So some of the cells start to specialize as like the primitive brain, and there's a carrying of the information to that. Then it goes into more complexity, but as it gets more complex, that sense of the separation of the membrane of the individual is actually still made of the environment. So it's still made of the chemistry. It's not separate. The environment and what's inside and what's outside is made of the same thing. The only difference is there's a membrane. So in its environment, it's still the living material of life. But as soon as it separates out into not me, me, there gets to be a feeling of the primacy of survival and the need to contract against the environment or move away from or move toward things that are good for it and bad for it. And then we get into kind of the human being as a child that's kind of amorphous and dependent and can't distinguish its environment, so that there's the social system is helping it out. So there's like a survival mechanism of the emotional brain of bonding and helping becomes important. The whole emotions are about how am I viewed in terms of the group and all that. And then the distinguishing within the human of the need to move from dependence to independence. There's got to be a decision about learning from, okay, that stove is hot, and then there's a sense of communicating and learning, no, don't put your hand on that, it's hot, and then there's like a child, like, really? Oh, let me see what that is, hot, like, hot, ooh, and then, ow, and then the complexity of the misunderstandings and the early identifications around, I was yelled at because it was bad to be hot, maybe I'm bad if I do that, and all the complexities around the emotion, the tribal things, survival, procreation, the drives, still dominate around the primacy of what we just played with, which is this representational system, which even the complexity needed to develop in the brain as a way to determine whether some kind of memory of whether this is safe or not safe. And then the scanning for danger of the outside and the inside. Is that dangerous or not dangerous? Let me check my memory. Let me check my representation of who I am and what I need. And so that system is what we're identified with.